Welcome to the Free Range Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Livermore. This episode is sponsored by the Program on Law, Communities, and the Environment at the University of Virginia School of Law. With me today is Matthew Burtner, a professor of compositions and computer technologies in the music department at UVA. His work explores ecology and the aesthetic link between human expression and environmental systems. His new album, Icefield, was recently released by Ravello Records. Matthew, thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Mike. Thanks for having me on your show.
So in the publicity materials for Icefield, I saw this question. It struck me as an interesting point of departure. The question was, if glaciers could speak, what would they tell us? And I guess my question for you is, do you see your compositions or the compositions on this particular collection of works anyway, as playing this kind of translational role between humans and the natural world?
Well, I think that the music, in that it embeds systems of change from the natural world as musical forms, I think that it challenges listeners to think outside of our conventional ways of understanding music. That's part of my hope with this kind of work, because I feel like part of our challenge as humans is to really consider the other inhabitants of this world as valuable, as living, as even sentient. And so I've extended that past the other animals and even plants, and start imagining, if the river has a kind of sentience or being, what is it thinking? Does the glacier have a kind of, is it an earth animal in some sense? And so the music is really trying to decenter humans in order to understand these other types of complex systems that make up our environment.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So on the title track, just to give an example, it's this kind of haunting, beautiful composition. And my understanding, again, just looking at some of the notes, is that the way that was constructed was you went out into the middle of this huge field of ice, basically. I mean, huge being like 1,000 square miles, so really big, with a saxophone and some recording equipment, microphones, and the like. So let's give that a listen. So how do you create this composition just from a physical perspective? What we're hearing includes sounds from the natural environment, wind and that kind of thing you could imagine, but also the saxophone itself. How is that, just kind of as a practical matter? How do you make that happen?
Well, yeah, it's super interesting just as a practical matter, because in this work I'm really imagining the ice field itself, which is the headwater for hundreds of glaciers in the region. So it's a kind of proto-glacier system. I'm imagining that as a musical instrument. And so I brought the bass saxophone out because it's like the biggest saxophone that I have, and the saxophone's the instrument that I play. So it's like, I wanted to bring my best to the ice field, the best thing I could bring. And so I took the bass out, and, the bass saxophone is this little tiny speck of gold out in the middle of this vast system of ice. And then I put microphones in the saxophone, but also inside the ice field. So I dug down, put microphones down in the snow, put them, around near the instrument, but also far away from the instrument. So you would pick up the environment, and then made this multi-channel recording where we are hearing the saxophone played, as an acoustic instrument, but we're also listening to the saxophone filtered through the ice field itself. So the snow, the sound of my playing is resonating down through the snow and being picked up by the microphones down there. And then that's, providing a kind of filter to the saxophone sound. And then the wind is in there and the sounds of the snow itself. I played the snow, so I moved my hands around on it and recorded that. All that's in this piece, and it's really trying to create this kind of, there's a couple ways of thinking about it. I guess one would be like a duet between the sax and the ice field, but the other is maybe a kind of hybrid human nature instrument that's like a kind of collaboration between this massive environmental system and this massive, quote, instrument. If you watch the video on YouTube, there's a music video for this track, and it's basically a real-time film of me playing that out there, so you can kind of get a sense of what we're talking about.
Yeah, and the scale, the scales really, the juxtaposition of scales is really fun there, because the bass sax is huge in a sense, but not compared to a 1,000-mile square ice field.
Yeah, so I hired a pilot to fly me out there with the bass sax, and it uses a kind of ski plane, so they can land on that ice field, and the bass sax and my recording equipment's pretty much all that could fit in that plane, and they dropped me off, and they said, well, I had to have survival gear for several days because the weather conditions are such that they don't know when they can come get you. So you have to be ready to stay out there. So I had to decouple everything from the snow because it's so cold, and the sun's just beating down. So I had to have everything also protected from overheating and just from the sun itself. So it's a really weird kind of working environment. Really interesting place to work. And of course, the batteries are dying, so you have to have power. So I'm using I have a solar charging system. And then I had to arrange it all because I was shooting it I was recording a video. Everything had to be kind of positioned so that it didn't, look messy or obstruct the idea of the piece or make sound itself in the environment. So it was a fascinating project. It was definitely one of the coolest projects I've ever been involved in.
Yeah, that is so much fun. And then when you were out there, this is, just kind of more of a process question, but again, I'm just interested, is the balance between improvisation on the spot and kind of composition that you had done ahead of time? Because it seems like I can imagine kind of going both ways into something like that. So was this a piece that you had largely composed ahead of time, entirely ahead of time, or was there improvisation that was happening as well in that environment?
Definitely improvisation, because I did compose a lot before and also prepare a lot before. I wrote melodies and certain kinds of materials and played the saxophone, imagining what I might do out there. And then I prepared by planning both the kind of practical survival necessities, but then also the microphone and how that was going to work. And so I went into it with this idea, but also not knowing it really at all what was going to happen, because it's like super unpredictable, right? It could be the weather's, first of all, it's just very unpredictable. Like this was my third attempt. I got dropped off on the third attempt. Oh. The first times the flights were canceled because of weather. And it was a good thing too, because they got like 5 feet of snow. So imagine being out there and 5 feet of snow on top of you. It's really very dangerous. But when I went, it was beautiful weather, and so I had prepared all this, and then I got there, and it was just kind of like, okay, now it's time to start. And the first thing I did was make coffee because, that's like a good place to start. Right.
Warm up the old lungs a little bit, right?
Yeah. And then just started trudging around, planning out the session and working on it. And I had my materials. So I I tried to, I started with those elements and then improvised with the ice field itself, and recorded. And then I took all that material back to the studio and then I think composed the piece by edits. So I'd edit what I did, take out a good part, find a part of the ice field sound that was really interesting and layer that. And so there's layers in the recording. It's not like a single take real-time recording. It's a creative mixing of a real-time recording session.
Right. Wow.
So there's a lot of improvisation, and it's, that's like, in general, I think of it as like an approach to the natural world, because, in composition and in human music, we often try to fix things, like fix them in frequency. So we want to be able to play a C on the instrument, needs to sound like a C every time, and then D needs to be tuned perfectly, a major second above that. But in the environment, it doesn't follow our interests in sound. There are different properties, different organizational systems of sound in the environment. And so part of this whole endeavor with environmental music is discovering what those systems are and learning to appreciate the beauty of what they are already, not necessarily try to make it conform to what we think of as beautiful music.
Yeah, this is really, really cool and interesting stuff. I mean, one question that just kind of comes out of that for me is, when I think of playing music, you're often, people can play music by themselves, but you're also playing with other people in a group of some kind. You think of improvisation, canonically jazz improvisation, where people are kind of riffing off of each other. And so I guess one question for you is, when you're out there in that environment, and especially it's a challenging environment, you're doing improvisation in that way. You're improvising with the physical materials and your setup, and it's all kind of spontaneous and in the moment. How much of that, once you actually get into playing and you're kind of in the flow of playing along, but you're responding to what's happening in the environment, to what degree does that feel like just the physicality of it, or the just musically, does it feel similar to when you're playing with other people, where they're changing, they're making changes, especially again in an improv kind of situation, and you're responding and they're responding? Does it have that same kind of feel to it when you're, say, in this situation where you were by yourself, but you're interacting with this whole complex environment?
Well, I would say that it does not feel like that at all. Pretty much because the natural world doesn't care about us. It doesn't, it's not responding to us. It's not even speaking. I mean, we're so far from speaking the same language of the natural world that we certainly can't play music with these systems yet in a way that they could respond. That has to be earned. That's like something, even improvisers who play together, human improvisers, are studying that kind of human interaction. Mm-hmm. So to translate that into human environment interaction, that's a far leap. For example, what I think feels the most alien in improvising with the natural world is the sense of temporality, because there's this ice field or the forest or a river or the ocean, no matter what system it is, these places have vast senses of temporality, and we're kind of fixated on the mesa level, 3-second events and 10-second melodies, and maybe a piece lasts 5 to 10 minutes. Well, the environment's not there's stuff happening on that level, but the grand cycles of the place and the systems of change can far exceed that. And so, if the ice field is interested in playing with me, it's gonna, I'm just a blip. I'm just a small blip in the scale of temporality, like a glitch in in the electroacoustic system. It's like a clip or something that happens. That's my whole experience. It's just a little clip inside the ice field. So that's really weird because you're playing, and you put all this energy into your instrument, you're blowing, you play your best melody that you've composed, and you play it and you expand it and you do all this stuff. And that's, you think you've done a good job, and then you just stop, and there's just like the ice field's still there, still persisting, doing what it was doing before you started. And you're like,
right.
Okay, so what can I do here? This is, and that's, so part of it is, there's two things that could happen. You could turn away from it. You could say, okay, the ice field is not sentient. It does not care. It does not listen to me. There's no kind of interaction here. I'm not part of it. But then another way to do is like, well, I'm not yet, I haven't discovered the mode of communication yet. I need to play more with it. I need to get used to this feeling of vast temporality. And even if I can't understand it, I have to kind of familiarize myself with that feeling that I can just stop in the middle of a phrase, get up, walk over, drink some coffee, go back. The ice field doesn't care, and then pick up where I left off. And that was okay, that would not really work in a jazz, context. If one of the musicians just kind of stopped playing, got up, walked away, came back 15 minutes later, the song would be over. It's over. But the ice field's not over. It's in a different scale of time. I don't know. That's kind of a strange way to think, but I'm really committed to understanding the temporality and the resonance of these natural systems as forms of aesthetics that we can engage with, partly as a way of decentering ourselves, as a kind of politics of decentering the human will as the only thing that we are focused on. And I think that music can teach us about, how to appreciate these systems in the natural world, even very strange ones like the ice field.
Yeah, wow. And so, one of the, as we're talking about timescales, this puts me in mind of some of your other work that I've come across, where you're doing something different with timescales. So what I'm talking about is where you take data that you collect or that is collected from the environment, and then you translate that data into sounds, basically, right?
Yeah.
As a way of, and that in a way that is also working with different timescales, because you're taking a process, like sea ice extent or something like that we could collect data on, and that's happening over very long time scales. In a way, that's the planet talking to us in its own timescale language, but it's hard for us to see that, or it's hard for us to understand that language at that timescales. And so you're translating that into a different timescale that maybe is a little bit more comprehensible for a human being.
Right. So yeah, this is two of the benefits of sonification. One is being able to listen to things that we can't otherwise listen to, like listen to data that doesn't itself make sound. So the waves on the beach make sound, and we can record them, and we can use that sound file to understand the energy of the movement of the water. But the light that's reflecting off the waves doesn't make sound, and we can't hear that. But with sonification, we can take some sort of light data and turn it into sound, so that we could couple that with the sound of the waves. We could couple a computer sonification of the light on the waves and have a different understanding of that system through sound. That's one of the interesting things about sonification. The other is that it does allow us to transpose the temporality, to take something that's like 40 years of data and bring it down to the level of a phrase, a musical phrase, or a musical movement. And so, you can hear these changes that are obviously outside of the realm of our perception, except over like a lifespan, but they could easily exceed our lifespans. And you could listen to them in a minute or two and get a sense of what's happening. So that is a really wonderful thing about sonification, and I have done this with like the work Ice Prince that's on the Ice Field album, uses ice extent data from the Arctic mapped into piano music. And then there's another piece on there called Sonification of an Arctic Lagoon that takes different layers of data and creates musical instruments and plays that out over a full year. So you in the 5 minutes of the piece, well, it's 4 minutes actually. In the 4 minutes of the piece, you hear 1 year of data mapped into that musical form, and it's dramatic. It's amazing in 4 minutes. It's so dynamic, this environment in the Arctic where things are frozen all winter and then they just explode with productivity in the summer months, and then they freeze again. And it's just this incredibly dynamic environment, and the sonification lets us hear that as a musical form.
Great. Well, maybe this would be a nice time that we could hear a little bit of a sonification that you put together, either one from Icefield or from another context.
Yeah, let's listen to a little bit of the sonification of an Arctic lagoon, and let's listen to perhaps like the late winter months in the Arctic. This would be like March, starting in about March, and then through the summer months, and you can hear that great explosion of harmonic spectral energy as the summer comes into sounding.
Great. So that's really, really interesting. And one of the things that this puts me just in mind of is the use of recording instruments and electronics and computers, and how that's different from kind of the old days when we would use more classical instruments, just standard instruments. And I guess what I'm thinking here is, in at least some music in the past, you have, I think, some attempts to portray like the changing seasons, or like that's kind of in the background, that there's something about the natural environment that has like inspired a musical composition. But here you're actually taking like data that's collected about the world and translating that into directly translating that, rather than kind of being inspired by that. And I wonder if that's an interesting, worthwhile distinction, just kind of almost in the history of music, or the history of Western music.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's a lot of music that involves a kind of impression of the natural world. And I think certainly for as long as people have been making music, they've been making music about the natural world. So in many ways, like this eco-acoustic approach is perfectly in line with what people have been doing since musicians have been doing forever. On the other hand, there's some new dimensions to it specifically because the tools that we have are different. The computer, the personal computer that allows you to apply sophisticated computation onto data and run things at a sample rate level so that you can turn that data into sound. That's a very recent development relatively in music. We can conjecture that, if Debussy had access to this kind of technology, or Mendelssohn, or anyone of the musicians of any different tradition that was inspired by the natural world, that they might have used this as well, and the music might have taken on different forms. I think that one of the things that excites me about the sonification and the more than impressionism is that the sonification, the data doesn't always sound like you want it to sound. And this is like a big, problem with it. It's like you turn the data into sound and it's like, well, that's kind of ugly, or
right.
that's kind of malformed. Like it's not satisfying. It's like, doesn't it change very much? Like, why is it going down when I feel like it should be going up? Well, that's because it's the data.
Right.
Like, that's the way the world's working, so then you have a choice. It's like, you can either change the sound, like change the data, but then you're not really representing the system anymore. You've moved into that impressionistic approach, or you can listen to it and try to, understand it for what it is and maybe find beauty in that, or learn about the beauty that's in there. That's the part that really excites me about the sonification. I mean, I can tell you that for every one successful sonification, like I think that Arctic Lagoon sonification successful, for every one of those, there's probably 30 that are not successful as music. And, so you listen to them, you learn about them, and then you have a choice. You can either just throw them away, or maybe you can use them in a way that's not like in the foreground. So I've used, for example, annual cycles of thawing and refreezing, these kind of oscillations of warming on an annual cycle. I've used that as beats. So I've taken that year-long cycle and compressed it down to 200 milliseconds so that it just goes bloop. But that little bloop contains a whole year of data. So where it wasn't very interesting to listen to the year kind of cycle, I found it quite exciting that there was a beat in the music that was like bloop, 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 that represented the actual data from the natural world. So at that point, there's no listener that's going to hear that and say, "Oh, I think that sounds like 1986, like the thawing and freezing." But that's okay, because this is also conceptual art. Like, it's okay that you can't hear everything that's in music. It's about what's there and about your mind being excited about what's there as much as it is about the actual notes that are there.
Yeah, so that's a whole fascinating line to explore too. And maybe we could get back to it, because I really do think that's a kind of a fascinating element of a lot of your work, is that the kind of conceptual piece of it, and that really matters. But one thing that I thought we just want to get on the table too is, it strikes me, and this is probably incomplete, so let's add to it as appropriate, that there are kind of a couple of different ways that your music incorporates this interaction with the natural world. So there's the sonification that we were kind of describing, right, where you have basically data that's been collected through some kind of data collection measurement kind of instrument that you can then translate over into sound, basically. And that's the sonification. Then there are using the natural world, or some part of the natural world, as an instrument, right? And that's what we were kind of talking about with Icefield, where you're playing the saxophone, but you're also swishing around the snow, and the saxophone's being played through the ice, and so the world kind of becomes this instrument that you're interacting with to create sounds. And then there's and again, kind of correct me if I'm wrong here. There seems like a third category as well, which is kind of directly, kind of in some sense, quote unquote, passively recording sounds that are happening in the natural world without necessarily your intervention, and then using those kinds of sounds in compositions and so on. Is that also part of your work as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've basically done about as good a job as like I've ever done in describing like ecoacoustics methods. When I talk about it, I talk about those three approaches. And when I teach ecoacoustic music, I teach those three approaches. We learn each one of those things is like a kind of field of study, and you can make pieces that are so to recast them into the music language. We call the recording the natural world soundscape or field recording. And that's, it's a creative action because you have to choose where to put the microphones and what microphones to use and all that. But it's, the idea is that you're recording some phenomena that's happening and then listening to it and understanding it and using it kind of as is. And then the sonification, which you described beautifully. And then the third would be the human nature interaction, which involves that kind of performance and performative element of interacting with these systems, which can be so wonderful as musical instruments, to bring the sensitivity of a musician who spent, imagine like a violinist spends 10 hours a day practicing for years and years and years and has this kind of amazing ear, hand coordination with this machine, the violin. To bring that level, that sophisticated training to the snow, I mean, it's like, the snow is in the music instrument instead of the violin. Right. There's so much, or the water or the sand, whatever it is, there's like as much detail and sensitivity in that environmental material as there is in the violin. We just don't tend to think about it as an expressive instrument. But so those three things definitely are all at play and to varying degrees in any composition.
Yeah, and it's interesting as we're kind of talking about that last category, the using or interacting with the natural world in such a way as to in this kind of instrument way, right? As you got to figure that those were the earliest musical instruments. Was kind of simple drums and flutes that you could kind of that maybe were just already someone found, or that required a very little amount of manipulation to create. So in a sense, it's very interesting because that approach is very presumably has a very long history, even if it's been a little lost for the last couple hundred years, at least in the West. Whereas something like sonification or recordings, those really rely on advanced technologies that we've only had in the case of recording, 100 years or so, 150 years. And then sonification is using data analytic techniques that are decades old.
Absolutely. That's such a good point. That's not something that I've really, articulated like that. I love that idea that one of these three things are not the same. There's one that's actually very, very fundamental, because you're totally right. Of course, it's about the human body and generating sound with external resonant sources. So like you can sing, you can move your hands, and you can touch things, and you can dance, and and that's our first music for sure. Then you pick up a stick, you pick up a rock, that becomes like another tool, and then it just goes from there. But absolutely, that's as old as music. And then these other things, we might be able to, with our academic sensibilities, to discover a history of sonification that predates computation in the sense of computers that we think of now. Like, there are ways that data was mapped into sound before the computer, actual data. It was done, by with hand by hand computing, and there's probably notions of recording that predate the field recorder, which was invented in World War II and came into use in the late 50s when the Nazi Germans left Paris and left their field recorders and were taken up by artists and used to make art. But before that, you have Messiaen in the forest with his music paper, listening to birds and transcribing them in real time onto paper. So Messiaen was with his amazing ear, was a kind of recorder himself. So we could probably keep going and find examples of that, but absolutely. There's one of those three approaches that's, really, really fundamental to music. Ironically, it's the one that's probably the least recognized in my field. So we often, there's lots of discussion of sonification. There's lots of discussion of soundscape and field recording, but there's very little research and discussion into human nature interaction and that kind of performance of natural materials relatively to those other two.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. And it seems that, just thinking about a violin, right? There's a whole history of those types of instruments. And, at some point it just kind of flows back into something that was, people walking around and just engaging with things that they found in the natural world. Now, thinking about the soundscape field recording, you spent a lot of time out in nature doing these types of field recordings. Do you have any? I'm wondering if we could hear perhaps some examples. If you have any favorites that you think tell kind of a particular interesting story or evocative of a particular place.
Oh yeah, that's interesting. Yes, of course. I mean, every recording, of course, is telling that story. But let me play. All right, so I have three just come to mind right now, but let me focus on just one because it's so unusual and so marvelous. When I visited Guatemala, and there was an erupting volcano in Guatemala, and so I hired some guides to take me up the Mount Pacaya where this volcano is erupting, and these people live in the shadow of this volcano, so they understand how to navigate the lava flows safely, whereas of course I didn't. And the guides took me up there to record the sounds of the lava coming out of the earth. And this was such an amazing system because you've got the force of the lava pushing out of the volcano and then quickly cooling at the surface when it hits the air. It cools on the surface of the lava, but it stays molten underneath. And so as these kind of crusts form on the surface, they're breaking off as the lava cracks its own forming skin, and they fall down and they make this kind of clicking, tinkling, breaking, shattering sound. But it happens in a way that's perpetual. It's like glass breaking perpetually. So I mean that's one that I think is really incredible. We could listen to that.
Great, that sounds wonderful. Let's give that a listen.
Another one is on the Virginia coast. You have these little crabs that create tunnels in the mud banks, and these are their little homes. They call them flutes. And when we're out there on those mud flats, I love to I have these little tiny microphones, and I'll thread them down inside the crab flute into its little hole, its little home, and just kind of eavesdrop on the domestic life of a crab in the mud.
Yeah.
And it's so beautiful because the flute actually, the crab flute actually it's a closed tube. So it has a resonant characteristic that's unique for that crab. So the crab made this flute, this hole, then the wind blows across the surface of it. The sounds from the outside world filter down into the tube, and it resonates at a particular frequency. So these crab flutes are actually kind of flutes, like musical instrument flutes. They have a pitch. And so like down inside this hole, you hear the whole world filtered through the crab's ambient resonant home. And then you hear the movement of the crab as it kind of probably wonders, what the heck is this microphone down here? I got to get this thing out of here, you know?
Right.
So that's also a really interesting recording, and I can play that for you too.
Yeah, wonderful. Let's give that a listen. So I love that it's called the crab flute. So that's like you didn't come up with it. You don't call that the crab flute. That's what the kind of the scientists or folks in the area call it.
That's right. And they're all different. So if you move the mic over to another one, it has a different pitch, a different sound. And it's just, and then the mud banks are just absolutely packed with these things, like thousands of them. And there's just crabs everywhere. And so if this is like a giant orchestra of flutes.
Wow. And you can actually hear it. Like if you're standing there, you'll hear the sound. Wow. That's really
No,
you
can't. You can't hear it. You can't hear it at the surface. You have to really amplify it, turn, go in close. It's like a microscope, you have to zoom in and then you can hear that resonance. But if you're just standing on the mud banks, of course, you don't hear the world of the crab. So this again is like about kind of transposing our listening out of our human centered perception into, the way a crab might hear the world. So it's a kind of, there's definitely like a post-humanism that runs through all of this environmental listening. And it extends beyond animal hearing and animal vocalization to plants, but also to, things like the forests and the glaciers.
Yes. It's one of the things it's just such an incredible feature of our world that when this magnification point, right? Like that you could take something like an insect, right? That's, very small, or something you couldn't even perceive, on, like bacteria or something that's happening at a very small scale. And when you magnify it, it's just this like beautiful thing. And there's this, the world is full of these things like that. We're just at the wrong scale to perceive, but it just nevertheless exists out there. And that now we have some tools that allow us to peer into these different scales, like looking at the planet, for that matter, from outer space. It's not something that you could ever do without a tremendous amount of technology, but it's this beautiful thing that's just kind of sitting there waiting. I don't know if it's waiting for us exactly, but it's there, and we can see it and we can experience it.
Totally. Yeah. No, so much of this, the joy of this kind of environmental music is participatory. It's about being able to actually listen yourself, so the microphone and the headphones allow you to kind of augment your orality so that you can now perceive things you couldn't before perceive. And those things are wonderful. And that participatory aspect of it is really, it never stops being surprising, and I constantly underestimate how powerful that is. It's that, when I'm teaching ecoacoustics, the first time that the students put on their headphones and have their field recorders and they start going around listening to things, it's the best day of the semester, because they're lost. I mean, I've lost the class. Like, as soon as they put on their headphones, they're gone. Like, it's so interesting and so consuming that, I always underestimate how interesting it is. So I'll be like, okay, everybody, time to regroup. And that wasn't nearly long enough. Like, I didn't give them nearly long enough to listen, because it's so fascinating. And then that just becomes like part of the way they hear. And I think of that as part of like expanding our understanding of the world, and really thinking outside, thinking that there are things that we don't perceive. There's, our phenomenology is limited, and that's good to know, but also it's okay. It's okay that there's many things that we don't know about the world, but it just sort of reminds us that we have to be extra conscientious, and careful and respectful and appreciative.
Right. Of all this. Yeah, it's really something. And one question I have for you, as we've been talking this over, is kind of like the aesthetics theory of some of the stuff, or maybe even kind of how this has influenced your own way of thinking about aesthetics or appreciating beauty or music more generally. So I can think of, on the one hand, you're obviously a highly trained musician. You're a professor in a music department, and as you were mentioning with respect to the violinist who's playing with a different kind of instrument in the natural world. There's value, or this is the question I sent, is the kind of the value of learning and sophistication that's happening in a particular intellectual cultural tradition. But then that trains us to hear certain things or to listen for certain things in a particular way, right? Like just even operating within a specific scale. And if something's off the scale, it sounds off, or we have certain expectations around what music is going to look like, or, we're going to return back to these themes or whatever else, right? There's just kind of certain structures that we've been trained to listen for. And so there's this kind of tradition. And then when you're, in the context of the sonification, or, when you're, recording things in the natural world, or operating, playing the kind of these unpredictable instruments, you're going to get sounds, you're going to get patterns, you're going to get sequences that are not going to fit with those traditions. And so I guess the question is, how do you see these things fitting together? Like, in a way, are we trying to undo the work that the traditions have done in training us? Do the traditions make us kind of unable to hear certain things, and then we're trying to unlearn those, or or is there something else happening? So anyway, it's just kind of it's a pretty broad question, but I just invite you to reflect on that relationship between the deep tradition that we inherit and kind of the work that you're doing that is really interacting with things that are very outside that tradition.
Right. I think that's so interesting. I really feel like that it's always about a process of opening. So like in my own experience, the knowledge of music and the ability to listen more closely, to understand what I'm hearing, to parse out voices, this is all about, opening up new dimensions of listening and being able to appreciate levels of sound that I wasn't able to appreciate before. So I definitely think of it in that the knowledge really helps, open up the world to just different dimensions of aesthetics, and that's just been a continually rewarding experience. I also, recognize that sometimes, people who study music, then they, maybe don't find themselves like appreciating something that's like too simple because it doesn't use it. But my feeling on that is that it never gets more simple. It just gets more and more rich, and you just kind of like find your way, so that things that you would have thought of as being simple, you just haven't figured out how to listen to them yet, so they're complex, but you just don't know it yet. And then if you keep listening, you keep discovering, you find the complexity that's already there. Or if something sounds chaotic, it just means you haven't listened to it enough to understand its order, its beauty. And so this has been my process of discovery, both learning traditional music, which I was trained in traditional music theory and analysis, and but then moving past that into computer music, and beyond that into eco-acoustic music. For me, it's just been every new kind of technology and new theory has just opened up new worlds of sound that was always there. I mean, I've been listening to the glaciers for as long as I've been alive, because I grew up around glaciers. But now I listen to the glaciers and I hear an incredible symphony and a kind of intelligence and a real beauty that was invisible or inaudible to me before.
Yeah, maybe we could just thinking about like where we grew up and that kind of and place, and that's importance for us, and also obviously climate change, and one of the we haven't kind of even gotten into the kind of environmental politics, right? So there's a way in which the music that you're creating is kind of operates on an aesthetic level that is kind of, I don't know if it's independent from politics, but it has its own status, let's just say. But then there is anything about the environment has a political valence to it, especially if we're talking about ice and the Arctic and climate change. And so I guess one question for you generally is, how much of that kind of political reality, political context, do you see as informing your work, or is it, or are these things kind of independent in your mind, and obviously your own, kind of personal history and growing up in Alaska, and kind of how that's informed your choice of subjects, I guess?
Well, I think of the work a little bit because of my biography. I guess I think of it as kind of accidentally political. In that I started off working in this way because I loved the natural world and I loved the sounds of it, and I thought human music was cool, but not nearly as powerful as some of the things I heard in the natural world. And so I wanted to kind of discover how that could become part of music. And then it was because of living in Alaska and studying music at a time of rapid global warming, when we were experiencing the dramatic effects of climate change early on in Alaska, then that work took on kind of later a political dimension. I don't mind that at all. I think that if there's a way that the music could intersect with discourse around issues that matter to people, that's just fantastic. And I certainly have ideas about political ideas, and I feel like the music is a little bit separate from my political ideas, in that what I try to do is create like a space for contemplating these topics, and I'll let other people frame the message and kind of address that in the way that they think it fits the context. So in my own way, that's like not to create the message, but rather just to let people learn by listening and feel like emotionally connected to these ideas, and celebrate them through melody and rhythm and just concept. And that just that process of listening to the world will open up in them a similar kind of feeling of empathy for the world. That's so it's a kind of a politics of not persuasion, but rather just like presentation. And I'm happy with that. So and that's, I think, also helped the music find a place in in these discourse, like the music being used, like when the State Department asked me to create music for their event, they wanted like ambient music that would be based on the subject of their gathering, but not, something with like a lot of fight song or anything like that, right? This is like a very kind of a different kind of music that's really celebrating the natural world, opening up as an aesthetic space so that Obama could put a message in there, and then his message was, about addressing climate change at the Paris Accord that was coming up. And then that happens, but that's like another person's field. Like that's for the politicians as far as I'm concerned, and they know how best to address those things. Meanwhile, I love it that the music can be a part of that discourse.
Yeah. And, one kind of related discourse, I guess, or related kind of reality of that we face in the kind of the Anthropocene and just the political moment that we're in is there's a lot of folks that are, let's just say there's an inevitable amount of climate change that's on the horizon. And it's obviously going to have tremendous consequences for the Arctic. And the question that we have is really, how much and how bad, not whether. And I just wonder, again, this is kind of with your own personal history and then the recent album and the work that you've been doing in the Arctic. Is there a coming to terms with these changes, or is there a mourning that's happening, or is there a celebration, or are these things kind of entangled? Like, I guess that's kind of the question is, you're capturing a moment in time in a place that's always changing, of course, over, millennia, but now we're entering into a time of more profound change. And I guess, the question is kind of, is that partially what motivated this work at this time? And your own kind of feelings about if there's sadness involved, or if it's something that, we can just kind of focus on what we have now and celebrate it.
Mm-hmm. Well, art has always given us a place to deal with tragedy, and that can be. I mean, we can dance to the song about death. We can sing along with the melody about a lost love, and these kind of love songs and these kind of dancing to destruction, topics of destruction. This is part of what music's been doing for a long time. In many ways, I think that the subject, the method's the same. If there's mourning involved, music's going to give us a place a way to mourn. It's going to give us a space to, allow our emotions to express. And maybe the songs are not about breakups. Maybe they're about, the loss of the polar ice, or the loss of the glaciers, or, the loss of a coast, or the, acidification of the ocean, or the arid of forests. They're going to be about topics of the environment because we feel deeply about these things. People feel deeply about them, and we are already kind of mourning them. So, it's not that I just think that it's kind of like a love song, right? It's like another kind of way of expressing art as a place for mourning. That's been a way that art's dealt with these things, these topics. And then, of course, there's also the active part of it that's not accepting necessarily that these are inevitable outcomes, but that there may be ways to repair certain aspects of the environment, to restore things. So right now I'm working on a project called Soundscapes of Restoration, and it's about listening to restoration projects. So we're out at the Virginia coast, and we're listening to the sound of seagrass beds. These seagrass beds were like nearly extinct, and they were brought back, and they've thrived again. And so here's an example of, a restoration project that is, having a large positive effect on the ecosystem. Another one is like the oysters. We're doing oyster reef restoration, or we, the scientists, are doing oyster reef restoration, and I'm listening to that. So recording those sounds of the oyster reefs, counting the number of oysters. This is another huge success story. So inside all these tragedies, there's also like modes of sustainability and restoration, and we can lean into those things as well and think about how we can do that in a way that's conscientious and ethically sound and economically viable, and then I'm going to make music out of those things. So those are like more hopeful kinds of subjects. It doesn't all have to be about loss necessarily. It can be about restoration.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So maybe my last line of questions for you today would be actually to return to a subject that you mentioned earlier, which is the notion of conceptual art and this kind of, when you have layers. I mean, in the music that you make, there's layers. There's a lot of layers, and and people can kind of approach these songs in different ways, right? So someone could be a casual listener, and it could just kind of play in the background, right? Folks can read more about the underlying music and the theory behind it, or kind of get into like understanding, for example, what the sonification is. If you've got a bloop where the bloop is compressed sound over like a year's worth of C extent data, or kind of whatever you have there. And so I guess the question is kind of almost like a recommendation, or how you think listeners can kind of approach these kind of conceptual pieces at different layers, and how should they kind of interact with these things? Is it intended to operate at different levels? And then if folks are interested in getting more into the kind of meaning behind what's happening, what are your thoughts on how to best do that?
Well, I think they're operating on different levels. So, I work really hard to try to find a music as an expression of a kind of sonorous expression that's purely in the material domain. That is, it has notes and rhythms, like organized sound that is satisfying to listen to. So that it is, it is interesting to listen to, that it unfolds in a way that leads you along, that doesn't turn you off. And so there's this kind of like, it draws you in. Like, I'm trying to make something that draws me in as a listener, and I guess I would like that to also then work for other people to draw them in. So on one level, the music's like designed completely to be understood on its own. Like if it came on the radio and you didn't know what it was, you might just hear that and go, "Whoa, what is this? This is interesting. I'm curious. I'm enjoying it." And then on another level, there's it's conceptual art. So the complete reverse of that would be you just read about it in a program, and it's like, "Oh wow, that idea for a piece is really interesting. Like that's actually a really compelling idea." And then that needs to also be worked out in the piece so that there's like this kind of conceptual unfolding that's just as interesting as the material unfolding of the sound itself. So like when you put those things together, hopefully the experience can be multifaceted. It can be kind of engaging your curiosity in your mind, but also like kind of making you feel things with your body and your in your ears, and that could be all working together. That's the kind of ideal situation, but it usually doesn't happen like that. It's usually more or less one or the other and different ways of listening. But I work really hard to put all that in there. So the pieces should be able to be approached just as sound, as melodies, as, on their surface, what's there. But then it's like the sonification of an Arctic Lagoon. Like, it's a pretty nice electronic track. You could listen to it, not know anything about what it's doing, not even know the title, and be like, oh yeah, that's a really nice piece of sound work. But then if you start understanding that every single sound in that piece is is correlated to a specific data in the environment, like light and velocity in the water and temperature, and that everything is actually of a real place that's unfolding in a year, then it's kind of an incredible experience, because it's like that thing that you thought was just an interesting sound object takes on another meaning, connects to another field, and then it's like a rich space for discovery. That's kind of my ideal. So I'm like always working on the conceptual side and on the material side.
Yeah, well, it's absolutely wonderful work. Thanks so much for sharing some of it with us today and your thoughts. It's been a real pleasure to chat with you.
Mike, thanks so much for having me on your show. I just love talking to you.